But first, he is the founder of the world's first counter-extremism think tank, Quilliam International, Maajid Nawaz. How you doing? Always great to see you. I mean that. I need you here more, sir. I really do. How often do you get to the United States? Not enough, right?
I'd like to come more. Hope to, if I'm not banned from the country.
I know. It's amazing. Well, I mean, there's so many things I could talk to you about, but you're such a great writer. I'm just going to quote you on some of these things.
Oh, you're going to quote me back to myself?
I'm going to quote you back to yourself. Like, I love you that you talk about the Voldemort effect, and I don't even read Harry Potter. That's a book for children, I understand.
Yeah.
So you tell me, I know what it is, but tell me what is the Voldemort effect?
Well, you see, those who are familiar with Harry Potter will know the bad guy in these novels is somebody called Voldemort, and you actually pronounce it correctly. The T at the end is silent. And
Dumb luck.
The people, the people of Harry Potter world are so petrified of this enemy that they are unable to name him. And so for the duration of these 6 books, they refer to him as he who must not be named. Now, of course, it takes he who must not be named.
Right.
You see where I'm going with
I
this?
do see where you're going.
So it takes a little child to say, actually, this person is called Voldemort, whose real name is Tom Riddle. And I use that, the Voldemort effect, to speak to our inability to name and shame and isolate Islamist extremism from the mainstream Muslim community.
Right, and you have almost unique credibility on this issue because 20 years ago, you were exactly who the British authorities were looking for when they talked about people who were involved in possibly terrorist activities.
After the Bosnia genocide in Europe and facing some severe domestic racism at home, violent racism and harassment from the police authorities as well, I went through a process of recruitment. Some ideological recruiters from a group known as Hizb ut-Tahrir recruited me, and I spent the better part of the next decade, my teenage years up until 24, proselytizing for a global caliphate, and I ended up as a political prisoner in Egypt, where I was sentenced to 5 years for membership of a banned organization. Now, I must caveat the group that I used to belong to remains legal in America and across Europe, because we didn't preach violence, though we did lay the ideological foundations for what has now become known as a caliphate.
Okay, so that's your background. I'm glad you spelled that out. Let me throw another quote of yours back at you. The poverty of expectations. Now, I know you're being sued, or you're suing the Southern Poverty Law Center for calling you, it's funny, you're fighting extremists, but they're calling you the extremist.
Well, I wanted to make this announcement here on your show. I've decided that I'm sick to death of well-meaning, and I'm sorry to bring identity politics into it, but it's relevant because of what I'm about to say. There's a bunch of well-meaning white men sitting in sweet Alabama who have decided, seriously.
Is that the Southern Poverty Law Center?
Yeah, the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Who normally go after, like, the Ku Klux Klan.
They were created to defend people like me.
Right.
You know?
Defend people
like me, right? Against people like the KKK, against the people that were chasing me when I was 15 years old with machetes and hammers and stabbing me and my friends. And they've decided to list me, along with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a Somali refugee, ex-Muslim, liberal thinker, as anti-Muslim extremists. And I think, you know, I'm sick and tired of a lot of the well-meaning, because, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, well-meaning liberal and left-wing, usually white men, who decide that I am saying what they don't agree with, don't allow for me to say about my own community, my own religious heritage, and as a result have listed me as an anti-Muslim extremist. So I'm gonna take them to court for defamation. I don't think these lists are helpful.
And you're crowdfunding it.
I will be crowdfunding.
I'd like to be part of that crowd.
Thank you, sir. Absolute pleasure.
Yes. And I invite you to also be part of that crowd. I mean, it's just insane. Again, you have almost unique credibility on this issue.
Well, the funny thing is, Bill, I've memorized half of the Quran. I'm a Muslim. I'm born and raised a Muslim to a Muslim family. I learned classical Arabic. I spent time in prison as a political prisoner fighting for what I then thought was my religion. I've changed my views as to the interpretation of my religion. And along come these people in sweet Alabama and decide that I don't have the right to speak about my own heritage and critique it from within.
And when did criticism of a religion equal bigotry.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, these guys, these are the same guys who arrogate to themselves the right to speak out against the Bible Belt, right? So the Southern Poverty Law Center is quite vocal against family planning, the anti-abortionist movement, quite vocal against Christian fundamentalists. In fact, they've listed some Christian conservative groups on their hate lists as well. So they arrogate to themselves the right to criticize their own Bible Belt, but don't want me to criticize our Quran Belt within my own community.
Right.
And it's this hypocrisy that I call as the bigotry of low expectations.
Right, low expectations,
Yeah.
right. To people who are called bigots, I mean, I have been called that, you have been called that. I mean, I hope they accept it more from you.
Well, and sorry.
But we're saying very much the same thing.
Yeah.
But poverty of expectations. I always say, you know, if something that would not be accepted here, you don't make a stir about overseas, isn't that the poverty of expectations in your term?
That is precisely
I mean, like Pakistan last year passed a law that was a wife-beating guide.
Yeah.
Not a law against wife-beating, a guide of how to. Now, if they did that in Kentucky, bad example, but... I love Kentucky. I love you, Kentucky. But, right, if we would not accept it here, but we don't raise a stir about it there, isn't that what you're talking about?
Absolutely. That's the bigotry of low expectations, when the same causes that they fight for within America are somehow deemed illegitimate for people like me to fight for within our own communities. The Quran specifies فَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, a passage that talks about husbands beating their wives. This is something we speak about regularly within our communities, that we've got to reform our approach to this scripture, and that begins, talking about the Voldemort effect, by acknowledging the problem exists. Now, if those vulnerable voices within Muslim communities, you know who else lists heretics who are deemed to be speaking against the accepted custom within Muslim communities? The jihadists. We know what happens when you list heretics among Muslims in this way. They end up dead. And it's no coincidence that you take the examples of lists. In Bangladesh in 2013, jihadists listed 84 Muslims as, persona non gratas. Within 3 years, 10 of them were assassinated. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who's on this list, the last time her name appeared on the list is when Theo van Gogh, the film director that she was working with in the Netherlands, was murdered by a jihadist, and they pinned a list on his body with a dagger. Ayaan was named on that as the next person they were targeting. Hope Not Hate, a UK-based organisation, in 2013 produced a similar hate list. Lars Hedegaard was listed on that. He was subjected later to assassination attempt. So when I'm speaking in this way, and a bunch of well-meaning...
You're brave.
Well, no, I'm just saying these guys are...
No, you're very brave.
They are endangering Muslim reformers.
You're getting it from both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But who do you fear more?
Well, I grew up fearing...
The people who would actually kill you.
I grew up...
Southern Poverty Law Center are being assholes, but they're not going to kill you.
Yeah.
Right.
One would hope not. Let's see how successful this lawsuit is and see what happens.
Well, you mentioned Ayaan Hirsi Ali. I mean, she was before Congress the other day, and I have some of her statements that she made. She wrote actually an op-ed in the New York Times. And she said, when it comes to the pay gap, abortion access, and workplace discrimination, progressives have much to say, but we're still waiting for a march against honor killings, child marriages, polygamy, sex slavery, or female genital mutilation.
Yeah.
She was calling out the 4 Democratic women senators who would not even bring her issue to the fore when she was testifying before Congress.
This is a real problem. I'm clearly, by my accent, somebody from the United Kingdom, and if we and we've done this with polls. I know you talk a lot about data. We have surveys that look at British Muslim attitudes to homosexuality, for example. One was in the Guardian newspaper, a left-wing newspaper, reported that 0%. 0% of British Muslims said homosexuality is morally acceptable. 0. And then a later poll, ICM, came along and said, OK, let's try this again. Hopefully we'll get a better result this time. If the statistics...
We do that here,
just
too.
Just try and repeat it. 52% of British Muslims said that they would ban homosexuality. This is what we're dealing with, and yet at the same time, you've got leftist activists who are very concerned about gay rights within white communities. There are gay Muslims who need our help. There are feminist Muslims who need our help. Liberal Muslims, ex-Muslims, apostates, right? They have the right, they have the freedom to choose the religion they want and the freedom from
This
religion.
is what I'm always so confused about. These are liberal issues. liberal principles. On the show last week, I mentioned what's going on in Chechnya, and a number of people said to me this week, what's going on in Chechnya? Well, this kind of it's a Muslim part of Russia, and there's kind of a pogrom going on. And let me read what the spokesman for Chechnya's leader said. He said, if such people existed in Chechnya, meaning gay people, if they existed, because, you know, they don't even exist, law enforcement would not have to worry about them, as their own relatives would have sent them to where they could never return.
Yeah.
And we're the problem?
Yeah. You see, and here, this is where the link between these attitudes and ISIS throwing gays off the top of buildings must be recognized. When you talk about hate speech, right? There's a Southern Poverty Law Center listing people that they deem are hate speakers or anti-Muslim extremists. This is the problem here. This is the hate speech. If you have these attitudes towards gays or women or ex-Muslims, and you see what ISIS is doing to them, that's the link we need to be making. Saudi Arabia lists atheism as a terrorism offense, believe it or not, right? And so when ISIS seeks out heretics and
they kill sorcerers.
Yeah. And so these are the sorts of links we've got to be making, and that's why the work I do is to challenge these ideas, try to at least, within Muslim communities.
But I know people out there are saying, well, that's ISIS. You know, that the most Muslims are not ISIS, and of course most Muslims are not.
Yeah.
What I like about what you do is, you know, you involve math. Math matters. Size matters. I think that's something you coined the term regressive left, another great term. I think they somehow ignore this fundamental fact that, you know, it matters how big something is. Talk about how big, what the number who are what you would call jihadists, people who are actually violent, versus Islamists, right? That's another level of it, versus just conservative.
So let me talk you through the United Kingdom in the last 4 months. We've had 4 terrorist attacks in 4 months. We began with the Westminster attack, then the Manchester attack, and then the London Bridge attack. And then the 4th one has just happened at a mosque where an anti-Muslim terrorist attacked Muslims in the same way ISIS does, with a van mowing passengers down. We've had these 4 attacks, but after the first 3, which were the jihadist ones, people began holding the Prime Minister to account. Why has nothing been done? How were we not able to stop these terrorists? And the security services said, we only have the capacity to monitor 3,000 suspected jihadists at any one given time. They said, we're at full capacity. Now, that would be worrying enough, Bill. Then they went on, and they said, however, though we're at full capacity at 3,000, we really need to be monitoring 23,000, because that's how many there are out there in the United Kingdom.
23,000 jihadists.
Jihadists.
People who actually want to commit
who are
violence.
ready to attack. This is according to our security services in the United Kingdom, right? That's 23,000 that they wish they could monitor, because they need to be monitoring them to make sure they don't attack anyone. So around those 23,000 jihadists, imagine how many more will be ideological bedfellows, the Islamists.
How many?
Right.
Now, so what is that level?
Right. So if we're going to go by...
We're talking about people who are not going to attack, but when there is an attack, they go...
Yeah. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt. The majority of Islamists are not jihadists. So there'll be far many more Islamists who are not jihadists around them, right? So let's triple that number. Okay, let's say most of these people aren't violent. They are just ideologically committed to theocracy. And then you've got the hardcore violent ones in the middle. That's only out of a population, Bill, of 4 million Muslims in the UK anyway. Now, if these figures don't indicate insurgency levels, and that's just in the United Kingdom, and that's 4 attacks in the last 4 months, if we're not in the middle of a global jihadist insurgency, I don't know what is, if that's not the case. We are in a serious crisis mode at the moment across Europe, and the figures are telling this. We have to recognize the problem before we can begin to deal with it.
So what can we do to make people here in this country? Because when you talk about England, it's not the same as America.
No,
that is not the situation here in America.
Muslims
and I think the problem
liberal.
with Americans is they hear this, and Americans tend to only think in terms of America. And they say, well, you know, the Muslims here, that's not the situation. But again, we're talking about 4 or 5 million Muslims out of a world population of over 1.5 billion. What can we do to get Americans on the side of traditional liberalism?
Yeah, well, the first thing, you're right, by the way, American Muslims are more liberal than the European Muslims that we're talking of here, but that doesn't mean you're immune to problems. Of course, you've had attacks here, you've got radicalization is a growing issue that everyone's worried about. But also we've got to remember that this last attack, the 4th one, was by an anti-Muslim extremist against Muslims.
Yeah.
And we cannot understate the importance of recognizing in Europe there has been a genocide against Muslims in Bosnia. Europe also has a history of, with Nazism, of entire societies going totalitarian. So when you ask how can we address this, we have to be aware of what I call the triple threat. And that is from the left, either, you know, the regressive left is a phrase we use for the cultural relativists who don't call out this bigotry when it comes from brown people. On the right, with the rising populism on the right, and then from the heavens above, the theocrats, the Islamist theocrats. And so we have to be aware of this triple threat when dealing with this as civil society. But the only true long-term solution will come through civil society pushback. And you have a great history of this with the American civil rights movement, with gay rights, within one generation. I mean, when I was 15, I grew up on hip-hop, by the way, based here in LA, the whole hip-hop scene that came from...
Who didn't?
Yeah, who did? I noticed, by the way, you had
Not me, I'm too old.
Well, you had Ice Cube on your show just, I think, was it last week? Well,
oh, yes.
I grew up on... I know that's sensitive topic.
Yeah, let's go on to the next thing.
But if you'd come to me when I was 15 and said to me, Maajid, within your lifetime, you'll see an African-American president, and one of the most prominent rappers will be white, and a conservative prime minister in the United Kingdom will introduce gay marriage equality, I never would have believed you. But that's how much change can occur within one generation.
Right.
So we need a civil society movement that has everybody standing together in solidarity against all of these bigotries, against the populism coming from the right wing, the control, totalitarianism coming from the left wing. I mean, you've got leftist attackers now attacking Republicans, James Hodgkinson, in the name of leftist activism, and he liked the SPLC page on his Facebook, you know. You've got this, the riot at Berkeley College. You've got Charles Murray attacked at Middlebury College, and the Democrat professor suffered concussion because she had the audacity to invite somebody that the leftists didn't agree with. See, so we've got to push back against all of this through a civil society movement. And I often say, Bill, I say you don't have to be black to challenge racism. You don't have to be gay to challenge homophobia.
Right.
And you don't have to be Muslim to challenge Islamist theocracy.
I need you here more.
Thank you, sir.
Maajid Nawaz, thank you very much, sir.